There are some people in this world who are just born different. Not different in a way that's easy to explain, but different in a way that you feel the moment you're around them. Like they carry something inside them that the rest of us can't quite see, but somehow we can sense it. She was one of those people. She grew up in a small town. The kind of town where everybody knows everybody, where the streets are narrow, where life moves slowly, and where dreams, real big dreams, don't come up in everyday conversation very often. Her family wasn't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. They were the kind of family that counted things carefully, counted meals, counted expenses, counted the days until the next paycheck. But in the corner of their small living room, pushed against the wall like it didn't quite belong, sat an old upright piano. Nobody really knew how it got there. It had been in the family for years, passed down, moved around, slightly out of tune, with two keys that stuck if you pressed them too hard. It wasn't a beautiful piano. It wasn't impressive. But it was there. And for this little girl, that was enough. She was 4 years old the first time she climbed onto the bench by herself. Her mother was in the kitchen. Her father was at work. The house was quiet. And she just sat there, looked at the keys for a long moment, then pressed one. A single note filled the room. She pressed another, then another. She wasn't playing a song. She didn't know any songs yet. She was just listening to what each key sounded like, listening to how the sound moved through the air and then slowly faded. It was like she was having a conversation with the piano, and the piano was answering back. Her mother came in to check on her and stopped in the doorway. She didn't interrupt. She just watched. Because even at that age, there was something about the way her daughter sat at that piano. Something calm, something focused, something serious asterisk, that told her this wasn't just a child playing around. This was something else entirely. By the time she was 6, she was picking up songs by ear. Nobody taught her. Nobody showed her. She would hear a melody somewhere, on the radio, at a neighbor's house, even a song her father hummed while he worked. And within a day or two, she would be playing it on the old piano. Not perfectly, but recognizably, clearly, and with a feeling in it that made people stop whatever they were doing and just listen. Word started to travel the way it does in small towns, quietly, from mouth to mouth. The neighbors talked. Her teachers at school noticed. People would find small reasons to come by the house, and somehow conversation would drift toward asterisk. Have you heard the little one play lately? Asterisk. But here is the thing about growing up in a small town with a big gift. Nobody around you quite knows what to do with it. They can appreciate it. They can admire it. They can shake their heads and say, asterisk, that child is special. Asterisk, but turning that gift into something real, something lasting, that's a different conversation. And nobody in her world had a map for that journey. Her parents did what they could. They found a local music teacher, a retired school teacher who had learned piano decades ago and still gave lessons on weekends. The lessons helped. She learned to read sheet music. She learned proper hand position, posture, the basics of technique. But within a year, she had already gone further than her teacher could take her. The teacher herself sat the parents down one afternoon and told them honestly, asterisk, I've taught her everything I know. What she needs now is someone better than me. Asterisk, that sentence stayed with the family for a long time. Because finding someone asterisk better, asterisk cost money they didn't have. It required connections they didn't have. It meant stepping outside of a world they knew into a world that felt very far away. But she kept playing. Every single day. Rain or shine, school day or weekend, happy or sad, she was at that piano. It became her way of processing the world. When something good happened, she played something bright and fast. When something hurt her, she played something slow and heavy. Music wasn't just a hobby for her. It wasn't a talent she showed off at family gatherings. It was her asterisk language, asterisk. The truest, most honest way she knew how to express what was happening inside her. There were hard days, of course. Days when she wondered if any of this meant anything. Days when she looked around at the small town, the old piano with its sticking keys, the modest life her family lived, and felt a kind of ache she couldn't quite name. Not sadness exactly, more like hunger. A deep, restless hunger for something bigger than what was in front of her. And then one day, a woman came through town. She was visiting a relative and happened to be at a small community gathering where the girl was asked to play. She sat in the back of the room, arms folded, watching with the quiet, professional attention of someone who has spent decades in the music world. She said nothing during the performance. She asked nothing afterward. She simply walked up to the girl's parents before she left and handed them a card. On the card was the name of a music program in the city, a serious one, the kind that opened doors. She said just one thing before she walked away. Asterisk, do and let her stay here. She's too much for this town. Asterisk that night, the family sat around the kitchen table and looked at that small card for a long time. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt like a door to something none of them had ever touched before. And on the other side of that door was a world that did not yet know her name, but was, whether it realized it or not, already waiting for her. She was 12 years old, and her story was only just beginning. The city was nothing like home. That was the first thing she noticed when they arrived. The noise, the size of the buildings, the way people walked fast and looked straight ahead, like they all had somewhere important to be, and no time to waste getting there. Back home, people walked slowly. They stopped to talk. They knew each other's names. Here, she was nobody. Just another face in a crowd that wasn't paying attention. Her mother held her hand a little tighter as they made their way through the busy streets. Neither of them said much. There wasn't much to say. They both understood what this trip meant. It wasn't just an audition. It was a chance. Maybe the only real chance they would get for a long time. And they both knew, without saying it out loud, that they couldn't afford to waste it. The music program that the woman had told them about was connected to one of the most respected music institutions in the country. Getting in wasn't just about talent. It was about being seen by the right people. And the most important person, the one whose opinion carried the most weight, was a maestro who had been in the music world for over 40 years. He had trained some of the finest musicians in the country. His students had performed on the biggest stages. When he said someone had promise, doors opened. When he said they didn't, those same doors stayed shut. She was going to audition in front of him. The night before, she barely slept. She lay in the small rented room her mother had arranged and stared at the ceiling. She wasn't thinking about the pieces she had prepared. She had practiced them so many times that her fingers knew them better than her mind did. She was thinking about something simpler, something harder to explain. She was thinking about whether she deserved to be there, whether a girl from a small town with a second-hand piano and no formal training really had any business standing in front of a man like that and saying, asterisk, look at me, listen to me, I belong here. That kind of doubt is a quiet thing. It doesn't shout. It just sits there beside you in the dark and whispers. But morning came. She got up, got dressed, and went. The building where the audition was held had a heaviness to it. High ceilings, long corridors, the sound of her footsteps echoing in a way that made everything feel more serious than it already was. Other young musicians were there too, sitting in chairs along the walls, holding their sheet music, some with their eyes closed, some moving their fingers silently over their knees, rehearsing without a piano. Everyone was nervous. Everyone was pretending not to be. When her name was called, she stood up, smoothed her clothes, and walked through the door. The room inside was large and dim. At the far end sat a grand piano, a real one, polished and perfect, nothing like the old upright she had grown up with. And behind a long table, a few feet away from the piano, sat the maestro. He was older than she had imagined, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that had stopped being easy to read a long time ago. He had a pen in his hand and papers in front of him. He glanced up when she walked in, looked at her for a brief moment, the way someone looks at something they haven't decided about yet, and then looked back down at his papers. "Whenever you're ready," he said. His voice was flat, professional, not unkind, but not warm either. She sat at the piano. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands in her lap for a second, took one quiet breath, and then she began to play. She played the first piece she had prepared, a classical composition she had been working on for months. From the very first notes, something shifted in the room. The sound of that grand piano was unlike anything she had felt before. It responded to her touch in a way the old piano at home never could. It was like being handed a voice that was finally big enough for everything she had been trying to say. She didn't just play the notes. She played the early mornings at home. She played the hours alone in the living room. She played every doubt she had felt the night before and every quiet hope she had carried for years. She played like this moment was the only one that mattered, because to her, it was. When she finished, the last note hung in the air for a long moment. The room was completely silent. She sat still, hands resting on the keys, heart beating so hard she could feel it in her throat. She looked up slowly. The maestro was writing something on his papers. He hadn't looked up. He finished writing, set his pen down, and then looked at her, not with the expression she had hoped for, not with surprise, or recognition, or even quiet respect. He looked at her with the measured, distant expression of someone delivering a routine conclusion. "Technically adequate," he said, "but emotionally undisciplined. The feeling is too much and too uncontrolled. That is not music. That is noise with structure." He paused, then added the words she would carry with her for years. "She will not become a serious pianist." He picked up his pen again. That was it. No explanation, no suggestions, no door left even slightly open. Just a verdict delivered in less than 30 seconds by a man who had stopped listening the moment he had made up his mind. She walked out of that room, down the long corridor, through the heavy front doors, out into the afternoon light. Her mother was waiting on the steps outside. She took one look at her daughter's face and understood everything without a single word being spoken. She opened her arms. And that was where the tears finally came, not inside that building, not in front of that man, not in any place where it could be used as proof that he was right, but here, outside, in the open air, where it was just the two of them. She cried, and then she stopped. And then, after a long silence, she looked up at her mother and said something that would only make sense years later. "I'm going to keep playing. Most stories skip this part. They jump from the moment of rejection straight to the moment of triumph, like nothing happened in between. Like the person just dusted themselves off, tried again, and suddenly everything worked out. It makes for a cleaner story, a more comfortable one, but it isn't honest. And the truth is, the years in between are where the real story lives. The years nobody sees. The years nobody claps for. The years that quietly build the person who eventually walks out onto that big stage. This is that part of her story. She went home after the audition, back to the small town, back to the narrow streets and the neighbors who knew her name and the old upright piano with its 2 sticking keys. And for a little while, she just lived with it. The rejection, the maestro's words. That flat, careless voice saying asterisk, emotionally undisciplined asterisk, like it was a fact about the weather. She didn't talk about it much. She wasn't the kind of person who processed pain by speaking it out loud. She processed it the only way she knew how. She played, not to prove anything. Not yet, just because the piano was still there, and she still needed it, and the music still came when she sat down and let it. Some mornings she would sit at that old piano and play for 2 or 3 hours without stopping, not practicing a specific piece, just playing, following wherever the music took her. And slowly, quietly, something started to shift. The hurt didn't disappear, but it began to change shape. It stopped being something that paralyzed her and started becoming something that fueled her. A teacher found her about a year after the audition. Not a famous teacher, not someone with a long list of celebrated students or a name that meant anything in the big music world. He was a quiet man who had spent most of his career teaching in small towns and regional music schools, someone who had never quite made it to the top levels himself, but who understood music deeply and honestly. He heard her play at a local event and asked if she was taking lessons. She told him what had happened, about the audition, about the maestro's words. She told him plainly, without self-pity, the way you describe something that happened and that you've already decided won't stop you. He listened. Then he said, "That man heard your talent and called it a problem. That tells you more about him than it does about you." She started learning with him the following week. He was different from anyone who had taught her before. He didn't try to flatten her playing into something safe and correct. He worked with what was already there, that deep, feeling, heavy way she had of approaching music, and helped her understand how to channel it, how to shape it, how to use it with intention rather than just letting it pour out uncontrolled. There's a difference between emotion that moves an audience and emotion that overwhelms them. He taught her that difference, not by telling her to feel less, but by helping her understand how to carry more, with steadiness, with precision, with purpose. The lessons changed everything. Slowly, carefully, her playing began to mature. But life outside the music wasn't easy. Money was a constant pressure. Her family had stretched themselves to support her dream, and there were stretches of time when she wondered whether it was fair to keep asking that of them. She took small jobs where she could. She taught basic piano lessons to young children in the neighborhood, kids who, like she once was, were just starting to discover that the keys made sounds and the sounds meant something. She charged very little. Some weeks she charged nothing at all because the families couldn't afford it. But she kept teaching, kept learning, kept playing, and she performed wherever anyone would have her. Small halls, community centers, regional festivals where the audience was sometimes no more than a few dozen people sitting in folding chairs. There were no reviews, no standing ovations, no one writing her name down in any important list. Just ordinary people who had come out on an ordinary evening and happened to hear something that stayed with them on the drive home. That was enough. It had to be enough. And on most days, it genuinely was. There were harder days, too. Days when she sat at the piano and nothing came. Days when she felt the distance between where she was and where she wanted to be so sharply that it was almost physical. She would hear about other young musicians, some of whom she knew were not more gifted than her, moving forward, getting opportunities, being invited into spaces that she was still locked out of. And she would sit with that feeling. Not bitterness exactly, but something close to it. A kind of quiet ache that came from knowing your own worth and watching the world take its time catching up. She never stopped. That is the simplest and most important thing about those years. Whatever the day was, easy or hard, inspired or empty, full of energy or full of doubt, she sat down at that piano. She never let too many days pass without playing, because she understood, even then, that greatness is not something that arrives all at once. It is something that gets built piece by piece in the quiet hours when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. Her playing in those years became something different from what it had been before. There was still that deep, natural feeling in it, that quality that had always made people stop and listen. But now there was something else underneath it, a kind of weight, a steadiness. the music of someone who had been tested and had stayed at the instrument anyway. You can hear that in a musician. If you know how to listen, you can hear the years in it. She was in her mid-20s now, still largely unknown beyond her region, still performing in small venues to small crowds, still carrying the Maestro's words somewhere in the back of her mind, not as a wound anymore, but as a reminder of exactly the kind of musician she was determined never to become, the kind who hears someone's truth and calls it a mistake. The world wasn't watching yet, but the world was about to turn around. Some moments in life don't announce themselves. They don't come with warning signs or dramatic build-up. They arrive quietly, through a side door, dressed like coincidence. And it's only later, sometimes much later, that you look back and realize that one ordinary phone call, one unexpected opening, one small twist of timing, was actually the moment everything changed. For her, it started with a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon. She was at home, going over some sheet music she had been working on, when her phone rang. A voice on the other end belonged to a coordinator from an international music festival. A well-known annual event held in a large city, the kind of festival that drew serious musicians, serious critics, and serious audiences from across the country and beyond. She had heard of it, of course. Everyone in the music world had, but it had never been part of her world. It had always existed at a distance, something she read about, not something she participated in. The coordinator explained quickly. One of the scheduled performers had fallen ill. The cancellation had left an unexpected gap in the program, just 2 days away. They needed someone who could step in, perform a full set, and hold the stage. A colleague had mentioned her name. He had heard her play at a regional recital some time ago and had never quite forgotten it. He thought she could do it. She was quiet for a moment, not because she was unsure. Inside, something had already said yes before her mind had finished processing the question. But she took that breath anyway, the kind of breath you take when you understand that what is being offered is not just an opportunity but a test, a real one, the biggest one she had ever faced. Yes, she said, I'll be there. She had 2 days. 2 days to prepare for the most important performance of her life, on a stage she had never stood on, in front of an audience that did not know her name. Another person might have been overwhelmed. She was focused. She went back to her sheet music, made her choices, and practiced. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the calm, deep concentration of someone who has been preparing for this moment for years, without knowing exactly when it would arrive. The evening of the performance, she arrived at the venue early. She stood at the side of the stage before anyone had taken their seats and just looked at it. The hall was grand in a way that was almost difficult to take in all at once. High ceilings, rows of seats that curved gently around the stage, lighting that gave the whole space a warm, golden quality, like the inside of something important. She had performed in small halls and community rooms her whole life. This was different. This was the kind of place that had history in its walls. She wasn't afraid. That surprised her a little. She thought she would be. But standing there, looking at that stage, she felt something closer to calm. A deep, settled calm. Like everything that had come before. The small town, the old piano, the audition, the maestro's words, the years of quiet work in rooms nobody paid attention to, had all been leading here, like she had already done the hard part. And this was simply the moment to show it. The hall filled slowly. By the time the program began, almost every seat was taken. Musicians, critics, patrons of the arts, people who followed the festival every year. They had all come for an evening of serious music. Most of them had not come for her. They didn't know who she was. Her name in the program was unfamiliar to them, a last-minute addition that some probably glanced at briefly before moving on. That was fine. She had spent her whole life being underestimated. She knew exactly what to do with it. When she walked out onto that stage, The applause was polite. The kind of applause an audience gives a performer they have no strong feelings about yet. She sat at the piano, adjusted slightly, looked at the keys for just a moment, and then she began. The first few notes silenced the room in a way that was almost immediate. Not silenced it because it was loud or dramatic. Silenced it because it was asterisk true dot asterisk. There was something in the way she played that reached across the space between the stage and the seats and simply held people. It wasn't showy. It wasn't designed to impress. It was honest, deeply, unmistakably honest. And an audience, a real audience, a listening audience, can feel that difference the moment it happens. She played through her full set without a single moment of hesitation. Each piece moved into the next like chapters of the same long story. The music rose and fell, breathed and paused, carried weight, and then released it. People who had come in that evening, with their arms folded and their expectations set somewhere specific, found themselves leaning forward without realizing it. Some of them would later struggle to explain exactly what had happened. They would use words like asterisk, moved, asterisk and asterisk, struck, asterisk and asterisk. I didn't know what it was, but I couldn't look away. Asterisk, when the final note ended, there was a pause. A real pause. Not the pause of confusion, but the pause of an audience that needs a second to come back to the room. And then the applause started, slowly at first, then faster, then louder. Then people were on their feet, and the sound of it filled that grand hall completely. She sat at the piano for a moment before she stood. She wasn't performing emotion. She was just sitting with it, letting it land, because she had waited a long time for this, and she wanted to feel every second of it. Later, much later, after the evening had ended and the hall had emptied, and she was standing outside in the cool night air, someone told her that a familiar face had been in the audience that night. An older man, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, sitting near the back of the hall, the Maestro. She said nothing when she heard this. She simply looked out into the night for a long moment. Then she smiled, quietly to herself, the way a person smiles when the universe does something that no one could have scripted, but that somehow feels exactly right. There is a version of this story where she stands up in front of the world and says everything she had been holding for years, where she names the Maestro, where she describes that room, that audition, those words, where she gets the dramatic moment of public vindication that people love to see, the kind where the person who is written off finally looks the person who wrote them off straight in the eye and says simply asterisk, you are wrong about me. Asterisk, that version is more satisfying in a certain way. It's cleaner. It has the kind of ending that gets applause. But that is not what she did. And honestly, that is what makes her story worth telling. The morning after the festival performance, the reviews came, and they were unlike anything that had ever been written about her before, because nothing like this had ever been written about her at all. Critics who had spent decades covering serious music used language they clearly had to reach for. Words like asterisk extraordinary dot asterisk, phrases like asterisk a pianist who plays as though the music is coming from somewhere deeper than the hands. Asterisk. One reviewer wrote that sitting in that hall the previous evening had felt less like attending a concert and more like witnessing something that could not be planned or manufactured, something that simply asterisk was. Asterisk, her phone did not stop that morning. Messages from people she had not spoken to in years. Calls from organizers, from music schools, from artists who wanted to collaborate. And beneath all of it, quiet and steady, the same feeling she always came back to, not relief, not triumph, but something simpler. Gratitude. Gratitude that the music had finally found the room it deserved. Invitations followed, real ones, the kind she had spent years watching other people receive. She was asked to perform at major venues in cities she had only ever read about. She was invited to record. She was asked to give talks, to sit on panels, to be part of conversations about music that mattered. And through all of it, she carried herself the same way she always had, with a quietness, a groundedness that people found both surprising and deeply refreshing. There was no sudden arrogance, no reinvention of who she was now that the world was paying attention. She was the same person who had sat at that old upright piano in the early mornings, just in bigger rooms now. Journalists, naturally, wanted the other story. Every interview found its way to the same place eventually. They would ask about her journey, about the early years, about what had shaped her, and then, carefully or not so carefully, they would bring up the audition, the Maestro, the rejection. They wanted to know how it felt. They wanted the emotion of it. Some of them, clearly, were hoping for something sharp, something quotable, a line that could sit in a headline and carry heat. She never gave them that. Every time she was asked, she would pause. Not a dramatic pause, just the natural pause of someone who thinks before they speak. And then she would answer honestly, and without performance. She would say that yes, it had been hard, that those words had stayed with her for a long time, that there had been days when she heard them louder than she wanted to. But she would also say, and this was the part that always seemed to catch people off guard, that she didn't carry anger about it anymore, that somewhere along the way she had understood something important, that the Maestro had not been cruel out of malice. He had been limited in what he could hear, in what he could recognize, in what he understood music to be. And limitations, however much damage they cause, are not the same as evil. He taught me something, she said in one interview, with a small, genuine smile. Just not what he intended. She meant it. You could tell she meant it. And that, more than any performance, more than any review, was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. She began mentoring young musicians. It started informally, a few students here and there, young people who had found her somehow and reached out. But it grew. She made a point of being available to musicians who came from backgrounds like hers. Small towns, modest families, no connections, no introductions, just talent and hunger and the hope that someone somewhere would take them seriously. She remembered exactly what it felt like to be that person. She never forgot it, and she made sure that the young people who came to her never felt the cold, dismissive weight of someone deciding their worth in 30 seconds. She told them the same thing, always. Not a speech, just a quiet, simple truth delivered the way only someone who has actually lived it can deliver it. Asterisk, the people who tell you no are not the final word. You are the final word. Keep playing. Asterisk, as for the Maestro, time, as it does, caught up with him too. He was in the later years of his life when he gave what would become one of his last significant interviews. The journalist asked him about the musicians he had mentored over his long career, his legacy, his proudest moments. And then, as the conversation turned, the Maestro was asked about her, about that audition, about the girl from the small town he had turned away all those years ago. He was quiet for a long time after the question was asked, long enough that the journalist later noted it in the piece. The pause, the shift in his expression, the way he seemed to be looking at something that wasn't in the room. Then he said, slowly and without excuse, asterisk, I was wrong about her. I was wrong about what music could look like, what it could come from. I heard something I didn't understand, and I called it a flaw. That is the kind of mistake that a man carries. Asterisk, she heard about the interview through a friend who sent her the article. She read it once, sat with it quietly for a little while. Then she set her phone down, walked to the piano, not the old upright anymore, but still just a piano, still just an instrument waiting for her hands. And she played. Not for the critics, not for the Maestro, not for anyone who had ever doubted her or dismissed her or decided she wasn't enough. She played for the same reason she always had. Because the music was there. Because it had always been there. And because some things, the truest things, don't need anyone's permission to exist.